All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Hi, I'm Amelia, a 37-year-old farmer from Iowa. Sharing this is hard, like trying to harvest a field with nothing but your hands and a dull spoon. But I need to process how my husband Mark's affair with a coworker from another department shattered our 11-year marriage. It began when the silence started to speak louder than our words ever had. You wouldn't think a farm could get quiet. There's always the low hum of the grain bin fans, the distant complaint of a tractor left running, the wind combing through acres of corn, a sound so much like the ocean it used to lull me to sleep. But there's a different kind of quiet that seeps into a house, into the space between two people sitting at the same kitchen table. It's a thick, woolly silence that muffles the clink of coffee cups and the turning of newspaper pages. That was our silence. I blamed it on the exhaustion. The pre-dawn mornings, the back-breaking labor, the constant gnawing anxiety about weather and commodities prices and equipment repairs. I told myself that's what happens after 11 years. The passionate fire of new love doesn't die. It just banks itself into steady, dependable embers, warm enough to keep you through the winter, but with no more reckless, dazzling flames. I was content with the embers. I thought he was too. The first crack wasn't a text message or a lipstick stain. It was a name, Sarah. He mentioned her one evening over meatloaf. Sarah in accounting, she had a great idea about the quarterly expense reports, really streamlined the process. It was innocuous, professional, and aqueous, professional. But it was the way he said it, a little lift in his voice, a spark of admiration that I hadn't heard directed at anything but a perfectly calibrated seed drill in years. I nodded, swallowed a bite of potatoes, and said it sounded smart. The silence settled back over us, but now it had a name floating in it. Sarah. Then the name started appearing more often. Sarah thought we should look into a new tax credit for agricultural suppliers. Sarah noticed a discrepancy he'd missed. Sarah was a whiz with spreadsheets. It was always professional, always logical, but it built a tiny invisible fence around them. A world of efficiency and smart ideas where I, with my dirt under my nails and my mind full of crop rotation schedules and livestock feed ratios, did not belong. My world was mud and weather and life and death. Theirs was clean, air-conditioned, and full of solved problems. He started working later. Not every night, but once a week, then twice. Just catching up, he'd say, his voice tight with a fatigue that felt different from the honest tiredness that comes from a day spent working the land. This was a nervous exhaustion. Big project with the corporate office. You know how it is. I didn't really. His job as a logistics manager for the farm supply company was something he did in a town 40 minutes away, in a building I'd never set foot in. It was an abstract part of our life, the thing that provided the health insurance and the paycheck that kept the farm afloat. My job was the land itself. His was the money that tended it. The changes were subtle. He got a new phone and became peculiarly protective of it, placing it face down on the counter with a quiet finality that felt like a rebuke. He'd shower as soon as he got home from work, scrubbing the office off him before he could touch me, before he could come out and walk the fields with me like he used to. He bought a new cologne, something crisp and citrusy, utterly unlike the warm, familiar scent of leather and diesel fuel that was the smell of our life together. I'd catch a whiff of it on his collar and feel a cold knot form in my stomach, a dread I dismissed as paranoia. This was Mark, my Mark, my Mark. The man who held my hand during both miscarriages, who didn't flinch when the vet told us the bill for saving a prized heifer would be astronomical, who knew I took my coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream without me ever having to ask. The discovery wasn't dramatic, and it tell you a property and a text directig, about upra. There was no screaming match, no slammed doors. It was a Tuesday. He'd left his laptop open on the kitchen table, something he never did, rushing out to deal with a downed fence in the north pasture. An email notification popped up on the screen. The preview text was visible. It wasn't from Sarah in accounting. It was from his Sarah. The subject line was blank. The message read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. Thank you for the book. You always know just what I need." The world didn't shatter. It just stopped. The hum of the refrigerator faded. The clock on the wall ceased its ticking. I stood there, my hands covered in flour from making bread, and stared at those words. You always know just what I need. I looked at my hands, rough, capable, utilitarian hands that could pull a calf and fix a pump and knead dough. What did I need? I needed the rain to hold off until we got the hay in. I needed the price of soybeans to go up. I needed my husband to look at me with that spark again. Last night he'd said he was working late. He'd come home smelling of that citrus cologne and restaurant food, not the stale coffee and toner of an office. He'd brought me a book, a novel about a woman finding herself in Paris. It was sitting on my nightstand. I'd thought it was a sweet, out-of-the-blue gesture. A peace offering for the silence. Now the dedication he'd written inside. For my Amelia, who deserves her own adventure, felt like the cruelest joke. He'd bought us both the same gift. His was probably inscribed with more intimate words. I didn't touch the laptop. I didn't scream. I walked back to the counter, wiped my hands on a towel, and went back to kneading the bread. I pushed the heels of my hands into the dough over and over, folding and pressing, my mind perfectly, terrifyingly blank. The silence in the kitchen was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the ghost of my marriage, sitting at the table, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The 11 years behind us stretched out like a field after a harvest, stubble and barren earth, everything of value already taken. And all I could do was bake bread, performing the motions of a life that had just been irrevocably broken. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside him, our backs to each other, a canyon of crisp, cold sheets between us. The air was thick with the scent of his new cologne and my unsaid words. Every breath he took felt like an accusation. I replayed 11 years in my head. Our first date at the county fair, the way he'd won a stuffed bear for me and looked so proud. The day we signed the mortgage for this farm, our hands shaking with equal parts terror and excitement. The quiet nights spent on the porch swing, his arm around me, watching the fireflies dance over the fields. Had it all been a lie? Or had it been real? And this was the betrayal, taking something beautiful and true and willingly shattering it for something as fleeting and shallow as a spark of admiration from a woman who knew spreadsheets better than she knew the weight of a human heart? The sun rose, painting the room in weak, gray light. He stirred, and I closed my eyes, feigning sleep. I heard the rustle of sheets, his footsteps padding to the bathroom, the shower hissing to life. He was washing her off again, washing the guilt away before he could face me. I waited until I heard his truck start and crunch down the gravel driveway before I finally moved. My body felt heavy, leaden, as if my grief had a physical weight. The day passed in a blur of automatic motions. I fed the chickens, their clucking and squawking a mundane symphony I usually found comfort in. Today, it was just noise. I checked on the pregnant heifer in the barn, my hands performing their duties by rote, my mind 1,000 miles away in a sterile office I'd never seen. What did they talk about? Did he make her laugh? Did he listen to her problems with a focused intensity he no longer reserved for me? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twist behind my ribs. The book. It sat on my nightstand like a bomb. For my Amelia, who deserves her own adventure, the irony was so profound it stole the air from my lungs. My adventure. Was my adventure to be the dutiful wife, ignorant and smiling, while he had his real adventure in town? I picked it up. The cover was sleek, a picture of the Eiffel Tower. It felt alien in my rough hands, an object from a world of cafes and art galleries that had nothing to do with manure and harvests. I didn't open it. I carried it downstairs, through the kitchen, and out into the yard. The afternoon was fading, the sky a deep, bruised purple. The air was turning cold. I walked past the barn, past the equipment sheds, to the old burn barrel we used for trash. Without ceremony, without a single moment of hesitation, I dropped the book inside. I poured a little diesel on it from the can we kept for the tractors. The smell was acrid, familiar. Intri and international problem, while yes international problem, and treating different tastes. It was the smell of work, of reality. I struck a match. The flame flared, a tiny, brilliant sun in the gathering dusk. I held it for a second, watching it dance, so fragile, so easily extinguished. Then I dropped it into the barrel. The whoosh of igniting fuel was a satisfying, primal sound. The flames leaped up, orange and hungry, consuming the paper, the promise, the lie. The pages curled and blackened. the image of Paris dissolving into ash. I stood there and watched it burn, the heat warming my face while the rest of me felt frozen solid. I didn't cry. The tears seemed to have burned away too, leaving behind something harder and colder. This wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a simple, necessary act of disposal. You burn what is contaminated. You burn what can no longer be of use. He came home late again. I was waiting for him, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee. The house smelled of the stew I'd made, a familiar, homely scent that now felt like a costume I was wearing. He walked in, looking tired, and stopped when he saw me. He could feel it. The air had shifted. The silence had a new quality, not passive, but charged, waiting. "Amelia? Everything okay?" he asked, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. The jacket that probably still carried her perfume. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt. It was my farmer's voice, the one I used when telling him a piece of equipment was beyond repair, when delivering bad news about a sick animal. Practical, final. He froze, his hand still on the jacket. I saw the panic flicker in his eyes, a quick, animal darting look. He knew. He'd been waiting for this, maybe for weeks. The charade was over. He sat down slowly across from me, his eyes not meeting mine. He looked at the steam rising from his coffee mug instead. "Talk about what?" he said. But it was weak. A formality. I didn't yell. I didn't list the late nights, the new cologne, the protective phone. I went straight to the heart of it. The way you have to when an animal is suffering and there's only one merciful thing to do. "I know about Sarah," I said. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. I read the email, the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I could see the calculations going on behind his eyes. Deny, deflect, explain. But the evidence was ash in a barrel outside. The truth was in my voice. He slumped in his chair, all the fight gone out of him in a single, defeated exhale. "Amelia, God. It's not what you think," he began, his voice a ragged whisper. "Don't." I stopped him, my voice still quiet but firm as iron. "Please, don't insult us both by telling me what it is or isn't. You bought us both the same book. You wrote in mine. What did you write in hers?" He looked down at his hands. That was my answer. The confirmation was worse than the discovery. The reality of it, sitting in my kitchen, at my table, was a physical blow. My husband. The man I'd built a life with from the ground up. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, and a single tear tracked down his cheek. It should have moved me. It only made me angry. He was crying for himself, for getting caught, for the mess he'd made. Not for me. Not for us. I stood up. I couldn't sit across from him anymore. The canyon between us was now uncrossable, filled with the ashes of a book and 11 years of trust. "I don't know what happens now," I said, my back to him, looking out the kitchen window at the dark fields. "My fields. My home. I need you to leave for a while. Go to a hotel. Go to your brother's." "I don't care. I can't look at you right now." "Amelia, please," he started to rise. "Now, Mark?" I said, and the steel in my voice surprised even me. It was the voice of a woman who commanded acres of land and large animals. It was a voice he hadn't heard directed at him in a very long time. It was the voice of someone who was done. I heard his chair scrape back. I heard his footsteps, slow and heavy as he walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door open and close. I didn't turn around. I kept staring out the window, watching my reflection in the dark glass. A woman alone, standing in the light of a kitchen that suddenly felt far too big and much, much too empty. The silence after he left was a living thing. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who know each other well enough to not need words. This was a hollow, echoing silence, broken only by the frantic hammering of my own heart. I stood at that window until my reflection became a stranger, a pale, wide-eyed woman etched in glass against a backdrop of nothing. I didn't move until the headlights of his truck had long been swallowed by the darkness, the red taillights winking out like dying embers. I turned from the window. The house, our home, felt different. The walls seemed to lean in, the familiar spaces suddenly foreign and accusing. His coffee mug sat on the table, still full, a monument to the conversation that had just ended everything. I picked it up. The ceramic was cold. I carried it to the sink. my movements mechanical, and poured it down the drain. I washed the mug, scrubbing it with a ferocity it didn't deserve, my hands shaking. Then I opened the cupboard and placed it right at the back, behind the old pots we never used. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want the daily reminder of his absence, or his presence, which now felt like a worse ghost. Sleep was impossible. The bed was too big, the emptiness on his side a yawning chasm. I ended up on the couch, wrapped in the old quilt his grandmother had made us, a wedding present. The fabric smelled of cedar and dust, a relic from a time when our future was a bright, unbroken road. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Every creak of a floorboard was him coming back. Every gust of wind against the eaves was a sigh of regret. I was a raw nerve, exposed and trembling. The only thing that finally pulled me from the spiral was the sound of the livestock. The heifer was close to calving, and the cows would need feeding at dawn. The farm didn't care about my broken heart. The animals didn't care about my shattered marriage. The land demanded its due, regardless of my pain. There was a grim comfort in that. A purpose. While my personal world was in freefall, the sun would still rise, the chickens would still need to be let out, and the water troughs would still need filling. The relentless, unchanging rhythm of this life was my anchor, the only thing stopping me from floating away into a sea of pure grief. I was out before the sun. The cold morning air a slap in the face that woke me up more effectively than any coffee could. The chores were a meditation. Each pitchfork of hay, each bucket of grain, was a task I could complete. There was a beginning and an end. A problem and a solution. Unlike the nebulous, painful mess of my relationship, this was work I understood. My body fell into its familiar patterns. The muscle memory a blessing that allowed my mind to go blessedly, numbingly, blank. Jose, our farmhand, arrived at 7. He's been with us for 5 years, a man of few words who understands the land better than anyone I know. He took one look at me, at the probably haunted look in my eyes I couldn't hide, and his own gaze softened with a quiet understanding. He didn't ask where Mark was. He didn't offer empty platitudes. "The hydraulic line on the big tractor is leaking again," was all he said, his voice a low rumble. "Needs a new seal." It was the kindest thing he could have done. He was offering me a problem I could fix. A tangible, mechanical failure with a parts number and a wrench and a solution. "I'll get on it," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. I spent the rest of the morning buried in the engine bay of the John Deere, up to my elbows in grease. The smell of diesel and oil was a familiar perfume. I focused on the puzzle of it, draining the fluid, removing the old, cracked seal, carefully cleaning the mating surfaces. The world shrank to the space between my hands. There was no room for thoughts of Mark, of Sarah, of emails and betrayal. There was only this bolt, that fitting, the precise alignment of the new seal. My entire universe was the size of a hydraulic pump. It was there, under the cool shadow of the tractor, that the first true emotion broke through the numbness. It wasn't sadness, it was rage. A pure white-hot fury that surged up from my gut so fast, it made me lightheaded. I tightened a bolt with a wrench, my knuckles turning white with the strain. How dare he? The thought was a hammer blow in my skull. How dare he bring his tawdry office world affair into this? Into our land? Into the home we built with our own hands? This life was hard, it was dirty, it was unforgiving. But it was honest, it was real. And he had chosen something cheap and artificial over it. Over me. I slammed the wrench down on the concrete floor, the clang echoing through the equipment shed. The sound was violent, satisfying. Jose, who was mending a fence nearby, didn't flinch. He just paused for a moment, then went back to his work, giving me the privacy of my anger. The tears finally came then, hot and angry, cutting tracks through the grime on my cheeks. I didn't sob. I just let them fall, my shoulders shaking silently as I leaned my forehead against the cold metal of the tractor tire. I cried for the betrayal. I cried for the future we planned that was now ash. I cried for the woman I was yesterday, the one who still believed in the embers of her marriage. That woman was gone. She'd been incinerated along with that stupid book. By the time I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and got back to work, the anger had receded, leaving behind a strange, cold clarity. I finished sealing the hydraulic line, refilled the fluid, and started the tractor. The engine roared to life, strong and healthy. No leaks. Fixed. I drove it out of the shed and into the yard. The sun was high now, a pale winter sun that offered little warmth. I sat in the cab looking out at the land. My land. The endless rows of cut corn stalks, the rolling pastures, the sturdy old barn. This was my constant. This was my truth. Mark had chosen a fantasy, a clean, air-conditioned illusion. But my reality was right here. It was muddy and difficult, and mine. He'd chosen a woman who needed a book about Paris. I was a woman who needed a wrench that fit a 15-millimeter bolt. The two needs existed in different universes. And for the first time since I saw that email, a tiny, fragile sense of resolve began to knit itself together inside me. He had broken our marriage, but he wouldn't break me. And he wouldn't break this. The farm, this life, wasn't just his to walk away from. It was a part of me, and I would damned well be the one to save it. The resolve I'd felt in the tractor cab was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake of grief. It held for the rest of the day, through the rest of the chores, through a silent, solitary dinner of a piece of toast I didn't taste. But nightfall was its own kind of enemy. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and the emptiness of the house expanded, filling every room with the ghost of what was lost. I couldn't face the bedroom. The couch in the living room became my bunker. I built a fort out of pillows and the grandmother's quilt, a pathetic attempt to create a small, defendable space within the overwhelming void. I tried to read an old farming magazine, anything to keep my mind from its relentless circular track, but the words swam on the page, meaningless. I turned on the television, some loud game show with flashing lights and shrieking contestants, just to have noise. Any noise, to fight the silence. It was a barrage of meaningless cheer that made me feel more alone than the quiet ever could. This was the phase I'd call ice cream for dinner, except I didn't have any ice cream. And I wasn't hungry. This was the bizarre, illogical grief they never tell you about. It wasn't just crying. It was this, sitting in a nest of blankets at 2 a.m., watching infomercials for vegetable choppers with an intensity usually reserved for open-heart surgery, just because the manic enthusiasm of the host was a temporary antidote to the hollow ache in my chest. I must have fallen into a fitful sleep because I was jolted awake by a sound that was utterly out of place. Not the wind, not the house settling. It was music, a low, rhythmic, thumping bass. It was coming from outside. From the barn. For a wild, disoriented second, I thought I was dreaming, or that Mark had come back and lost his mind. I pushed off the quilt and went to the window. The barn doors were shut, but a faint, pulsing light, blue and red, leaked through the cracks. The music was a dance track, something you'd hear in a club. On my farm. My first instinct was alarm. An intruder? Kids partying? I grabbed the heady flashlight we kept by the doorless for light, more for a weapon, and pulled on my boots over my pajamas. I marched across the cold, dew-soaked yard, my heart pounding, ready to shout at some trespassing teenagers. I yanked open the side door to the barn, flashlight raised. The scene that greeted me was so surreal it took my brain a full 10 seconds to process it. The barn was empty of animals. We'd moved the herd to the south pasture last week. In the center of the clean-swept concrete floor, under the harsh glow of the work lights I used for late-night repairs, was me. Or rather, a version of me I didn't recognize. I had my earbuds in, connected to my phone that was propped against a bale of hay. The music was blasting directly into my own skull. I hadn't heard the bass from outside. I'd felt it vibrating through the floorboards. And this other Amelia, was dancing. Not a gentle sway. Not a familiar two-step. This was something raw and utterly unself-conscious. My eyes were closed. My face was a mask of fierce concentration. My movements were jerky, uncoordinated, a desperate, physical flailing. I was throwing my body around the empty space as if I could shake the pain out of it, as if I could expel the betrayal through the soles of my feet. I wasn't crying. I was sweating. I was sweating. My pajama top was stuck to my back. I looked possessed. I stood there in the doorway, frozen, watching myself have a complete and total breakdown disguised as a rave for one. This was the learning to break dance at 3 a.m. phase, and it was horrifying and mesmerizing all at once. This was the deep, bizarre suffering the blueprint had promised. The song ended. In the sudden silence of my own head, I became aware of my own ragged breathing. I opened my eyes, and I saw myself standing in the doorway. The disconnect was instantaneous and jarring. The me on the floor stopped, her arms dropping to her sides. I stared at the me in the doorway. We just looked at each other, two halves of a shattered whole, separated by a threshold. The one in pajamas and boots, holding a flashlight like a club. The one in the center, drenched in sweat and bathed in the unforgiving light of a 100-watt bulb. The me on the floor didn't look embarrassed. She looked defiant, as if challenging the sensible, practical me to say something. To tell her to stop, to be reasonable, to go back to bed. The sensible me had no words. All I could do was lower the flashlight. The anger from earlier was gone, burnt out in that frantic, solitary dance. What was left was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, creeping sense of awe at the raw, untamed creature my grief had created. Without a word, the me in the doorway turned around and walked back to the house. I left her there, that other self, in the barn. I didn't go back to the couch. I went upstairs, to my bedroom. To my bed. I didn't sleep on his side. I slept squarely in the middle, claiming the territory. The sheets still smelled like him, but now they also smelled of cold night air and my own strange, newfound courage. The next morning, there was no evidence of the barn dance. The work lights were off. The hay bale was back in its place. It felt like a dream. But when I went to feed the chickens, I found myself moving differently. My body was sore from the unaccustomed exertion, a pleasant, honest ache that felt like progress. The grief was still there, a cold stone in my belly, but it had been moved, shaken loose. It wasn't a cure. It was a release valve. I realized then that healing wouldn't be a linear path. It wouldn't be about being strong every moment. Some nights, it would be about sitting numbly in front of an infomercial. And some nights, it would be about turning the barn into a discotheque and screaming into the void with your entire body. Both were true. Both were necessary. I had to let the bizarre grief stages happen. I had to let the strange new version of myself exist, even if she was messy and unhinged and danced terribly at 3 a.m. she was fighting. And for now, that was enough. The bizarre midnight energy had burned itself out, leaving behind a peculiar calm. The ice cream for dinner phase, it seemed, was a cycle waves of numbness punctuated by these strange, frantic eruptions of feeling. But the morning after the barn, something else emerged from the quiet. Not quite strength, not yet. It was a low, simmering impatience. A refusal to let this hymn define the boundaries of my days any longer. My world had shrunk to the size of my pain, and I was suddenly claustrophobic inside it. The farm demanded my attention, and I gave it willingly, but my mind was beginning to wander down other paths. For 11 years, my identity had been a partnership, Mark and Amelia, the farmers. It was a package deal. Now, half of that package was gone, and I was left staring at the wrapper, wondering what was actually inside, just me. What did Amelia on her own actually like? What had I set aside because it didn't fit the us's? The answer came from the most mundane of places, the pantry. I was searching for a jar of tomato sauce when I found it, pushed to the very back behind bags of rice and flour. A small wooden box. Inside wasn't jewelry or love letters. It was pottery tools. A ribbon tool, a needle tool, a wooden rib, a spool of cutting wire. They were dusty, some slightly rusted, relics from a community college class I'd taken a lifetime ago, before the farm, before Mark. I'd loved it. The smell of the wet clay, the quiet, focused concentration of centering it on the wheel, the magic of pulling a shape from a formless lump. I'd been good at it. But farming was a practical life. There was no time or money for hobbies that produced fragile, useless things. So, I'd boxed it up. I'd put that version of myself away. I pulled the wire through my fingers. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment. It was a quiet, simple thought. I have time now. That afternoon, after the chores were done, I didn't go inside to stare at the walls. I went online. I found a used pottery wheel for sale in a town 30 miles away. It was old, sturdy, and cheap. I called the number, arranged to pick it up, and didn't allow myself a single second to talk myself out of it. This wasn't about finding a new passion or healing. This was about rebellion. A small, quiet rebellion against the practicality that had defined me. I was going to make something fragile. I was going to make something useless. I set the wheel up in a corner of the equipment shed, next to the workbench. Jose came in, saw it, and raised an eyebrow. New project, boss? Something like that, I said, not offering any more explanation. He just nodded as if farmers taking up pottery was the most normal thing in the world and went back to welding a broken gate hinge. The first bag of clay was a disaster. I'd forgotten everything. My hands were too stiff, my pressure too uneven. The clay wobbled and collapsed, a sad, muddy puddle on the wheelhead. I scraped it off, slapped down another lump, and tried again. And again, my back ached. My hands, so capable with a wrench, felt clumsy and alien. Clay was a different kind of truth. It didn't respond to force. It responded to patience, to a gentle, consistent guidance. It was the exact opposite of everything my life had been for the last decade. But I kept at it. It became my new 3 a.m. ritual. When the silence of the house became too loud, I'd go to the shed. The hum of the wheel was a better noise than the television. It required all of my focus. I couldn't think about Mark, about Sarah, about the crushing loneliness, because if my mind wandered for even a second, the clay would rebel. It would become a monument to my inattention. Days turned into a week. The collapsed lumps slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to hold their shape. I made a dozen lopsided, thick-walled bowls. They were ugly, they were pathetic. They were the most beautiful things I'd ever created because they were mine. They were proof that I could start with nothing, with less than nothing, with a pile of dirt and make something new. It was a metaphor so obvious it was almost embarrassing, but I clung to it. I was in the shed one evening, covered in a fine layer of gray slip, trying to coax a somewhat taller form into a vase-like shape, when my phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a text from an unknown number. My heart did a familiar, painful lurch, a conditioned response, hoping it was him, dreading it was him. It wasn't. It was a woman named Brenda. She ran the local feed co-op. She'd heard from Jose, who'd apparently been showing off pictures of my art, about my new pottery kick. The text read, "Hey Amelia, Jose showed me your bowls. They have real character. I'm hosting a small craft fair next month for local artisans. Mostly jams and knit stuff, but we'd love to have some pottery. Any interest? No pressure." I stared at the message. Character. That was a kind word for their tragic, misshapen forms. A craft fair. The idea of putting my sad little creations out for people to see, to possibly buy, was terrifying. It was one thing to make ugly bowls in the privacy of my shed. It was another to present them to the world as something of value. The old me, the practical farmer, would have laughed and typed back a polite, immediate refusal. This was a silly distraction, not a side hustle. But the new me, the one who danced in barns and made things from mud, hesitated. She looked at the wobbly vase on the wheel. It wasn't good, but it was hers. It was a piece of her put back together in a new shape. My thumbs hovered over the screen. This was the, "Okay, enough of this," moment. The rally. It wasn't about becoming a master potter. It was about saying yes. It was about leaning into the weirdest, most unexpected passion to emerge from the wreckage. I took a deep breath, smelling the damp, earthy scent of the clay. It was the smell of potential. I typed back, "Thanks, Brenda. I'm just a beginner, but I'd love to. Count me in." I put the phone down, my hands trembling slightly, but not from sadness. From a nervous, electric excitement I hadn't felt in years. I placed my hands back on the clay, feeling its cool, pliable skin. The wheel hummed. I had a month. I had a lot to learn. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I had a goal that was entirely, completely my own. The text from Brenda had lit a tiny, fragile fuse inside me. The yes I typed out was more than just agreement to a craft fair, it was a contract with myself. A promise to show up. For a month, my life became a binary existence. There was the farm. The relentless, familiar rhythm of dawn chores, fixing fences, checking herds, the sharp, honest smells of diesel and earth. And then there was the shed, my sanctuary of quiet concentration and damp clay. The wobbly vases and thick-walled bowls began to slowly, incrementally, improve. My hands, so used to gripping steel and leather, learned a new language of pressure and caress. The clay responded not to force, but to presence. It demanded I be completely there, in that moment, my mind empty of everything but the spinning wheel and the shape emerging beneath my fingers. It was the most effective therapy I could have invented. There was no room for thoughts of Mark, for the hollow ache in the house when all my mental energy was focused on keeping a cylinder from collapsing. The day of the craft fair arrived with a crispness in the air that hinted at true autumn. My stomach was a knot of nerves. I packed my pieces, a dozen of my least awful bowls and a few small cups, in a crate padded with straw like I was transporting fragile eggs. They looked so amateurish, so humble. I almost backed out a dozen times, imagining the polite, pitying smiles of the other vendors. The fair was set up in the gravel parking lot of the feed co-op. Brenda had strung up cheerful bunting between posts. There were tables laden with jars of honey and preserves, racks of knitted scarves, and displays of scented candles. It was a humble, homespun affair, exactly the kind of thing our small farming community did well. I set up my rickety card table at the end of a row, arranging my pottery with a feeling of profound inadequacy. For the first hour, I mostly just stood there, hands shoved in my pockets, nodding at people I knew. They'd stop, glance at my table, their eyes flickering with surprise. "Amelia, I didn't know you did pottery," they'd say, and I'd mumble something about it being a new hobby. They'd pick up a bowl, turn it over in their hands much like mine, calloused and capable, and then gently set it down again with a kind smile before moving on to buy a jar of pickles. It was exactly as excruciating as I'd imagined. And then, a little after noon, a minor disaster struck. A gust of wind, funneling between the buildings, caught the corner of my tablecloth and sent 3 of my bowls tipping toward the gravel. I lunged, but it was too late. I heard the sickening crunch of clay meeting stone. There they were, my painstakingly made, imperfect creations shattered into a dozen pieces. I stood frozen, staring at the fragments. It felt like a sign. A perfect metaphor for my entire life. Everything I touched lately just ended up broken on the ground. The fragile hope I'd been nurturing shattered along with the bowls. Hot tears of frustration pricked at my eyes, and I bent down, my back to the crowd, hastily gathering the sharp pieces, wishing I could just disappear. "Don't use your bare hands. You'll cut yourself." The voice was calm, low, and matter-of-fact. I looked up, blinded by the sun. A man was kneeling across from me, holding out a dustpan and brush I hadn't even noticed he'd fetched. He wasn't anyone I recognized. He wore a simple plaid shirt and jeans, but there was a quiet competence in his movements that was instantly familiar. "Here," he said, and without waiting for a reply, he began to efficiently sweep the larger fragments into the dustpan. I just knelt there, clutching the broken pieces in my hands, watching him. He had a kind face, lined from the sun, and his hands were the hands of someone who worked clean now, but with the permanent evidence of labor etched into the skin. "Thank you," I finally managed to whisper, my voice thick. "It's the worst feeling, isn't it?" he said, not looking at me, focusing on his task. "Spending all that time making something, only to see it break in a second. Happens to me all the time." "You're a potter?" I asked, surprised. He didn't look the type. He gave a short, quiet laugh. "No. Veterinarian, large animal, my creations are a lot messier and they tend to walk away after." He finally looked up and met my eyes, and his were a warm, steady brown. "But the principle's the same. You pour your effort into something fragile, and sometimes, despite your best efforts, it breaks. Doesn't mean the effort wasn't worth it." He stood up, holding the dustpan full of my failures. "Where's your trash?" I pointed numbly to a bin nearby. He disposed of the pieces and came back, handing me the dustpan. "I'm Ben, by the way. Ben Carter. I have a practice just outside town." "Amelia," I said. "I farm the Henderson place." I was still off balance, disarmed by his simple, practical kindness. "I know the place," he nodded. "Beautiful land. I was out there a few years back for a difficult calving. You had a big Charolais cross, if I remember right." I blinked, astonished. "You remember one cow from years ago?" He shrugged, a small, humble gesture. "I remember the animals. And the people who care about them." He glanced back at my table, at the remaining pottery. "These are good, honest. They look like they were made by someone with strong hands who isn't afraid of a little imperfection." It was the first genuine compliment my work had received. It wasn't flowery or false. It was direct and observant. and it meant more than any hollow praise ever could. "They're a work in progress," I said, feeling a real smile touch my lips for the first time that day. "Aren't we all?" he replied. He gave me another small nod. "Well, I'd better let you get back to it. It was nice to meet you, Amelia. Don't be discouraged by the breakage. It's just part of the process." And with that, he turned and walked away, melting into the crowd around the honey stand. I stood there by my table, the dustpan still in my hand, the sting of the broken bowls completely gone. In its place was a warmth, a simple human connection that had nothing to do with pity or my failed marriage. He hadn't asked about Mark. He hadn't looked at me with the sympathetic gaze I'd grown to dread. He'd seen a broken thing and offered a dustpan. He'd seen my pottery and called it honest. I looked down at the remaining bowls on my table. They were still lopsided. They were still humble. But under Ben's gaze, they had somehow become enough. Just like that, the entire day shifted. The unexpected meet-cute hadn't been in a broken elevator or over online chess. It had been over a dustpan full of my shattered pottery in a feed co-op parking lot. And his green flag wasn't that he was perfect. It was that he understood the value of effort, even when it ended in breakage. And he remembered the cows. The rest of the craft fair passed in a pleasant, sun-drenched haze. Ben's words had acted like a charm, lifting the cloud of insecurity that had hung over me. People still stopped by my table, but now I didn't see pity in their eyes. I saw interest. A few even bought pieces. Mrs. Gable from the post office picked up a slightly crooked bowl, turning it over in her hands. "I like it," she declared. "It has personality. Machine-made things are so perfect, they're boring." She paid me with cash, folding the bills into my hand with a firm nod. It wasn't just a sale, it was a validation. By the time I packed up, only 3 pieces remained unsold, plus the one I'd decided to keep for myself, the first bowl that had held its shape without collapsing. It was thick and heavy, glazed a simple earthy green, a monument to my first shaky success. I drove home, the empty crate rattling in the passenger seat, feeling a sense of accomplishment so profound it was almost dizzying. I had done it. I had put a piece of my heart out into the world, and the world hadn't laughed. It had, in its small way, accepted it. The high lasted until I pulled into the driveway. The house stood there, silent and waiting. The reality of my situation came rushing back in. Mark had texted a few times over the past week, vague, apologetic messages asking to talk, to explain. I'd ignored them. I wasn't ready. Talking meant reopening the wound, and I was just beginning to scab over. I carried my lone bowl into the kitchen and set it on the table. It looked small and defiant against the vast, empty landscape of the wooden surface. I made tea, the ritual feeling both familiar and lonely. As I sat there, blowing on the steam, my eyes kept drifting to the bowl. It was so imperfect, so clearly handmade. You could see the slight wobble in its rim, the tiny thumbprint I'd left in the base. Ben's voice echoed in my head. "They look like they were made by someone with strong hands who isn't afraid of a little imperfection." Was that me? Was I unafraid of imperfection? I looked around the kitchen. My marriage was the greatest imperfection of my life, a catastrophic flaw in the vessel. And my initial reaction had been to want to smash it, to discard it entirely, just like those broken bowls in the parking lot. But I hadn't smashed my marriage. He had, and I hadn't thrown away all the pottery after the breakage. I'd kept going. I'd sold some. I'd kept this one. A strange thought occurred to me, a connection forming slowly. The bowl was beautiful because of its imperfections, not in spite of them. They were proof of its journey, of the hands that had made it. Was it possible that that my life, could be like that too? That the cracks and the flaws and the broken parts could someday be what made it interesting? What gave it character? The idea was so foreign, so revolutionary, that I almost laughed out loud. For weeks, I'd seen myself as a broken thing, a failed marriage, a discarded wife. What if I was just being reshaped? What if this pain was just the kiln, firing me into something new and stronger and more unique? It was a hopeful thought, and hope felt dangerous. It felt like setting myself up for a fall, but it also felt true. The next day, I was in the feed store, loading bags of mineral supplement into my truck, when I saw him again. Ben. He was at the counter, talking to Brenda about livestock vaccines. My heart did a little stupid flip. I busied myself with strapping down the bags, trying to look casual, suddenly hyper-aware of my messy ponytail and dusty jeans. Amelia. I turned. He was walking over, a smile in his eyes. Hey, how'd the fair finish up? Good, I said, wiping my hands on my pants. I actually sold most of them. Thanks to you. To me? I just handed you a dustpan. It was more than that, I said, and I meant it. The vote of confidence helped. He nodded, accepting this. He had a quiet way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, or in the feed store. Glad to hear it? You sticking with it? I think so. It's good for me, I get that, he said. Everyone needs something that's just theirs. For me, it's restoring old radios. It's all logic and circuits. The opposite of my job. Quiet. I tried to picture this large animal vet, this man with capable hands that pulled calves from struggling mothers, sitting in a quiet room soldering tiny wires. The contrast was fascinating. It was a quirk, a real one. That sounds precise, I managed to say. He laughed. It is, and frustrating. Half the time I can't figure out why they won't work. He looked at me, and there was a kindness in his gaze, but no pressure. Listen, I know this is probably out of the blue, and tell me if it's not a good time, but there's a diner in town. The Skyline. They have the best pie you'll ever eat. Sour cream raisin. If you ever want to, I don't know, talk pottery or radios or the best way to treat hoof rot, he was asking me out. In the most low-key, unassuming way possible. Over pie and talk of hoof rot. It was the least romantic, most wonderful proposition I'd ever received. My first instinct was panic. To retreat. To say it was too soon, that I was too broken, that the idea of sitting across from a kind, interesting man felt like a betrayal of the grief I was supposed to be wallowing in, but I looked at him. He wasn't Mark. He wasn't a fantasy or an escape. He was just a man who fixed animals and old radios and who had handed me a dustpan when I needed one. He was asking for pie, not a lifetime commitment. I thought of the bowl on my kitchen table, imperfect, but still whole. Still worthy of holding something. I took a breath. Pie sounds good, I said, my voice only shaking a little. But I have to warn you, I'm a pretty good judge of pie. A real, full smile broke across his face. I'd expect nothing less from a woman who makes her own bowls to eat it out of. He fished a card out of his wallet. It was simple, just his name and number. No pressure. Whenever you're free. He gave me a final nod and walked away, leaving me standing next to my truck, holding a business card for a veterinarian, my heart pounding like I'd just run a race. I looked down at the card. Benjamin Carter, DVM. It felt solid in my hand. Real. I hadn't jumped. I hadn't thrown myself into anything. But I'd said yes to pie. It was a small step. A tiny, imperceptible shift. But it was a step forward, on my own 2 feet. And for now, that was everything. The business card sat on my kitchen table next to the green bowl for 2 days. It wasn't a deliberate test of willpower, it was just that the farm demanded everything I had. A water pump on the south pasture well gave out, and replacing it was a day-long ordeal of mud, rusted bolts, and frustration. Then, a early cold snap threatened, sending Jose and me scrambling to get the remaining winter squash harvested before a frost could kiss it. The physical exhaustion was a gift. It left no room for nervousness, for overthinking, for the dizzying swirl of what-ifs that started the moment my head hit the pillow. On the 3rd morning, the card was still there. The sun was out, the crisis had passed, and I had no more excuses. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone and typed in the number. I didn't let myself think. I just pressed call before my courage could desert me. He answered on the 2nd ring. Ben Carter. His voice was calm, professional. It grounded me. Hi, Ben. It's Amelia, from the feed store. I cringed at my own awkwardness. The professional tone melted into a warm familiarity. Amelia. Hey, how's the pottery coming along? Recovered from the great shattering? I laughed, a real surprised laugh. I have. Thanks to your emergency services. I was calling about that pie. If the offer still stands. It absolutely stands, he said without a hint of hesitation. How about tomorrow? I'm out at the Larson's dairy all day today with a mastitis outbreak. Not exactly glamorous. The fact that he just casually mentioned a mastitis outbreak on a first date call should have been weird. For me, it was the most normal thing in the world. It was real. Tomorrow works, I said. Skyline Diner? Noon? They do a great lunch too. Best meatloaf in the county. Meatloaf and pie. I like your style, Ben Carter, I said, and I meant it. It's a gift, he deadpanned. See you then, Amelia. The call ended and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It had been easy, normal. No pretense. Just two adults arranging to eat diner food. The next day, I didn't know what to wear. My wardrobe was divided into two categories: work clothes covered in dirt and stains, and a few sad, faded nice things I wore to funerals and weddings. I settled on a clean pair of dark jeans and a simple blue sweater that didn't have any holes. I left my hair down, which felt strangely formal. I looked, okay, normal. Like a version of myself I hadn't seen in a while. The Skyline Diner was everything he'd promised. A classic chrome and vinyl relic with the smell of frying onions and fresh coffee hanging in the air. He was already there, slid into a booth by the window, reading a veterinary journal. He looked up as I walked in, and his face broke into a smile that reached his eyes. He stood up, a old-fashioned gesture that felt incredibly sweet. You made it, he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. I did. Hope you haven't been waiting long. Just long enough to read about the latest advancements in parasite control, he said, folding the journal away. Fascinating stuff. We ordered meatloaf for him, a club sandwich for me, and 2 coffees. And then we talked. Actually talked. It wasn't an interview. It was a conversation. We talked about the absurdities of farming life, about the stubbornness of sheep, about the best way to can tomatoes. He told me about getting kicked by a horse his first year out of vet school. I told him about the time I tried to shear a sheep myself and gave it what looked like a terrible haircut. We laughed. I laughed more in that hour than I had in the past 6 months. He asked about the pottery, really asked, listening intently as I described the struggle of centering the clay. He didn't look at me with the pitying gaze I'd come to expect from everyone else. He looked at me like I was interesting, like my story was worth hearing. And then, as the waitress cleared our plates and brought us 2 slices of legendary sour cream raisin pie, he did something that changed everything. He got a text. His phone buzzed on the table and he glanced at it. His expression softened, and a small, private smile touched his lips before he quickly typed a response and put the phone away, screen down. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew that smile. I knew that quick, furtive movement. The ghost of Mark's betrayal rose up between us, sucking all the air out of the booth. The pie turned to dust in my mouth. The easy comfort was gone, replaced by a familiar, sickening dread. He must have seen the change in my face. His own smile faded. Everything okay? He asked gently. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit here and pretend. The words were out before I could stop them, sharp and brittle. Was that her? He looked confused for a second, then his eyes widened in understanding. He didn't get defensive. He didn't get angry. He looked sad, for me. No, Amelia, he said, his voice incredibly soft. It wasn't to her, it was my mom. She's in a book club and they're arguing about the ending of their latest novel. She was demanding my literary analysis immediately. He paused, watching me. I'm not him. The simple statement landed with the force of a physical blow. I'm not him. The shame washed over me then, hot and suffocating. I had taken my hurt and my fear, and I had aimed it directly at the kindest man I'd met in years. I had painted him with the same brush as Mark. Ben, I'm so sorry, I whispered, my voice thick with humiliation. I don't know why I said that. That was terrible of me. It's okay, he said, and he meant it. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, patient understanding that somehow made me feel worse and better all at once. You've been through hell. It's going to take a while for those reflexes to fade. He pushed the pie plate slightly toward me. The pie really is good. Try it. And my mom's book club really is that intense. Last month, she threatened to defriend Mrs. Henderson over a disagreement about a metaphor. I took a bite of the pie. It was perfect. Sweet, tangy, with a flaky crust. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. What was the book? I asked, my voice small. He grinned. That's the right question. It was a historical romance about a pirate and a botanist. Mom's team pirate. Mrs. Henderson is staunchly team botanist. It got ugly. I let out a shaky laugh, the tension slowly bleeding away. He had taken my moment of insane jealousy and my unfair accusation, and he had disarmed it completely with a story about his mom and a pirate. He wasn't just kind. He was graceful. We finished our pie. The conversation found its way back, a little more careful now, but still real. When the check came, we split it. Another simple, normal thing that felt revolutionary. He walked me to my truck. The autumn air was crisp and clean. "I had a really good time, Amelia," he said, leaning against the driver's side door. Despite the inquisition. "I'm really sorry again," I said. "And I had a good time too. Thank you for the pie. And the understanding. Anytime," he said. He didn't try to kiss me. He didn't even hug me. He just reached out and gave my hand a quick, warm squeeze. Drive safe. I got in my truck and watched him walk to his own car, a sensible, muddy SUV with a veterinary emblem on the door. I replayed the lunch in my head, the laughter, the easy talk, my horrible misstep, and his gentle, unwavering decency in the face of it. Mark's betrayal had left me seeing ghosts in every shadow, expecting lies in every smile. But Ben wasn't a shadow. He was solid, he was real. And he'd just shown me, in the clearest way possible, that not every man would break my trust. Some would hand you a dustpan when your world shattered, and then patiently explain their mother's book club drama when you accused them of being a liar. I started the truck. The ghost of Mark shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by the very real, very kind figure of Ben Carter, waving once before he got in his car. For the first time, the road ahead didn't look so terrifying. The easy confidence from the diner lingered for a day, a warm glow that fought back the chill of the empty house. But reality, like the Iowa weather, has a way of shifting abruptly. A certified letter arrived, stark and official amidst the junk mail and seed catalogs. It was from Mark's lawyer. The word dissolution screamed from the header even before I read the contents. Inside were the preliminary divorce papers, a cold, clinical dissection of our 11-year life together into assets and liabilities, proposed divisions of property and debt. My hands went numb, the paper rustling softly. It was one thing to feel the fracture, to live in the silent aftermath. It was another to see it rendered in stark black and white, in legalese that reduced our shared history to a list of things to be split. The farm was listed. The equipment, the bank accounts. My pottery wheel was not listed. It was too new, too insignificant. And entry asked another process, wide another process industry. A sob caught in my throat, half hysterical laughter, half despair. They could divide the tractors, but they'd miss the one thing that was truly saving me. I didn't call him. I didn't scream or cry. I folded the papers neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and placed them on the kitchen table. They sat there like a dead thing. All day, as I mucked out stalls and repaired a section of barbed wire fence, the envelope was there in the periphery of my mind, a dark spot on the landscape of my day. Ben texted me that evening. A simple, low-pressure message. "How's the clay situation? Any more breakages?" I looked at the phone, then at the envelope on the table. A part of me wanted to retreat, to cancel whatever this was before it could really start. How could I sit and eat pie with a man when my marriage was being formally, legally dismantled in a manila folder on my table? It felt disrespectful to my own grief. It felt like cheating on my sadness. But another part of me, the part that had danced in the barn and said yes to the fair, rebelled. Mark hadn't been respectful. He hadn't been loyal. Why did I have to be a martyr to a corpse of a relationship? The papers weren't the end of me. They were the beginning of a painful, necessary administrative process. I picked up the phone. I didn't mention the papers. I just typed back, "No breakages." Just a lot of lopsided mugs. "How are the radios? Any new signals from the past?" His response was almost immediate. Static mostly, but I'm persistent. "You free this weekend?" There's a flea market over in Cedar Springs. They usually have a guy with a barn full of old junk. Good place for radio parts, and maybe some unique pottery tools. He wasn't asking me on a fancy dinner date. He was asking me to go junk hunting. It was the most perfect, unromantic, understandable date anyone could have conceived for me. It wasn't about impressing each other, it was about sharing a piece of our weird, quiet passions. "I'd love to," I typed back, and for the first time since the envelope arrived, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. Saturday morning, I met him in the gravel lot of the abandoned drive-in theater that served as the flea market. It was a sprawling, chaotic mess of tables, tents, and open truck beds piled high with other people's cast-offs. The air smelled of fried dough, old books, and faintly of gasoline. Ben greeted me with a thermos. "Coffee," he said. "I make it strong enough to stand a spoon in. Fair warning." I took a sip. It was tar black and delicious. "You weren't kidding," I coughed, laughing. "This could power a tractor. Told you," he grinned. "Ready to dig for treasure?" We spent the next 2 hours wandering through the aisles. It was a bizarre and wonderful window into his world. He'd get excited over a box of vacuum tubes, holding one up to the light like a diamond. I found a vendor selling old woodworking tools and spent 20 minutes examining a beautifully crafted wooden rib for pottery that cost less than a cup of coffee. He didn't try to hold my hand. He didn't put his arm around me. We just walked, side by side, pointing things out to each other, sharing stories. He told me about growing up on a dairy farm, about how he'd always preferred fixing the sick animals to milking the healthy ones. I told him about the first crop I'd ever planted on my own, a 1/4 acre of pumpkins that got wiped out by a hailstorm a week before Halloween. "What did you do?" he asked. "Cried," I said honestly. Then I harvested the smashed ones and made a ton of pumpkin puree and gave it to everyone I knew. We had pumpkin everything that winter. You can't control the weather. You can only control what you do after. He nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "That's it exactly." We stopped at a food truck and got greasy burgers, eating them on a picnic table at the edge of the market. It was then, with my hands greasy and the sun warm on my face, that I brought it up. "I got the divorce papers," I said, my voice neutral. I didn't look at him, just watched the crowd of people browsing through other people's forgotten things. He was quiet for a moment, finishing a bite of his burger. "I'm sorry, Amelia," he said. Not sorry as in pity. Sorry as in acknowledging a difficult thing. "It's okay," I said, and I realized I mostly meant it. It's just paper. It's just the official receipt for something that's already over. It just makes it real in a different way. "The legal part is the worst," he said, balling up his wrapper. "It turns a heart thing into a math problem. It's brutal." "Yeah," I whispered, grateful beyond words that he didn't try to minimize it or offer empty optimism. He just sat with me in the truth of it. "When my dad passed," he said after a moment, "going through his things was like that. It wasn't grief, it was logistics. Deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. It felt like we were erasing him, one object at a time. But we weren't, he was already gone. The stuff was just stuff. Stuff. The love wasn't in the things. It was in here." He tapped his chest. "Always in te. The smiles are dias and dias are dias. Always are dias are dias are dias are dias. Where is in here and ias are dias are dias are dias are dias. The papers are just the legal stuff. They don't get to touch the good stuff you keep in here." Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of being seen, of being understood on a level I hadn't known I needed. He'd just perfectly articulated the strange, hollow pain of the envelope on my table. I blinked them away. "So what you're saying is, this is all just logistical debris?" I said, gesturing to the entire flea market around us. He laughed, a rich, warm sound. "Exactly, and we are the brave archaeologists sifting through it, looking for the good bits worth saving." We finished our lunch and kept exploring. I bought the wooden rib. He found a 1940s Bakelite radio cabinet in rough shape but with good bones, as he put it. We loaded our treasures into our respective vehicles. As we stood by my truck, the sun beginning to lower in the sky, he didn't try to kiss me. He just smiled. "This was a good day," he said. It was, I agreed. It was the most normal, abnormal day I'd had in months. "I'll let you know if this old girl ever picks up a signal," he said, patting the radio cabinet in his passenger seat. "I'll let you know if I make a mug that doesn't leak," I replied. He laughed, got in his car, and drove away. I drove home to the envelope on the table. It was still there. It was still real. But it felt different now. Smaller, less powerful. It was just logistical debris. The good stuff, the stuff worth saving, wasn't in that envelope. It was in my shed, on my wheel. It was in the memory of a day spent sifting through the past with a man who understood that you could find value in broken things, and that sometimes, the best way to face the future was to go looking for old signals. The flea market had shifted something fundamental inside me. The envelope on the table didn't vanish, but its power did. Ben's words had reframed it. It was logistics, math. It wasn't the story of my marriage. It was the receipt for its end, and I was done letting the receipt dictate the narrative. This new phase wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic changes. It was about the quiet, deliberate construction of a new normal. Our traditional happiness, the blueprint promised, would be built on a uniquely us foundation. Ben and I fell into a rhythm that was anything but Hollywood. Our perfect weekend wasn't fancy dinners or dramatic gestures. It was this. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind of cold, relentless drizzle that turns the farmyard into a quagmire and makes the world feel small and cozy. Ben's SUV was parked next to my truck, a familiar sight now. Inside, the farmhouse was warm, smelling of wood smoke from the stove and the rich, earthy scent of stew simmering in the crock-pot. The living room floor was unrecognizable. We had dragged the couch back against the wall and constructed a massive, ridiculous fortress out of every blanket, quilt, and spare sheet I owned. It was a lopsided, sagging castle, held together by clothespins and sheer willpower. A string of fairy lights we'd found in a Christmas box was tangled through the fabric roof, casting a soft, whimsical glow inside our makeshift tent. Ben was in the kitchen, rummaging through my pots and pans. "The big mixing bowl, the yellow one," he called out. "Second cupboard to the left of the sink," I called back from inside the blanket fort, fluffing a pile of pillows. I heard a clatter and a triumphant, "Aha!" He ducked through the doorway of our fort, holding the big yellow bowl. It was filled to the brim with popcorn. "The feast is served," he announced, placing it ceremoniously in the center of our nest. I laughed. "Is that the entire batch? You have to commit to the popcorn, Amelia." "There are no half measures in blanket fort cuisine." He settled onto the pillows beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. It was a comfortable, easy contact. He reached for the laptop we'd set up on an overturned crate. "Now, the real debate begins. Your pick." This was our ritual. Our happy, traditional build. We would bicker good-naturedly over what to stream. He had a soft spot for terrible, old sci-fi movies with rubber monsters and dramatic music. I preferred historical dramas with sweeping landscapes and tense social etiquette. We'd argue our cases with mock seriousness before inevitably settling on a nature documentary, a neutral ground where we could both marvel at the world without arguing about plot holes. Today, we settled on a documentary about deep-sea creatures. The screen lit up with bizarre, glowing fish and vast, dark canyons. The narrator's voice was a soothing drone. The rain pattered a steady rhythm against the roof. We sat in our blanket cave, passing the giant bowl of popcorn between us. It was so simple, so profoundly undramatic, and it was the happiest I'd been in a year. This was the new normal. It wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It was about building something new right alongside it. The pain was a quiet room in the house of my life now. I knew it was there. I sometimes visited it. But I didn't have to live in it anymore. I had other rooms now. I had a pottery shed. I had a blanket fort. I looked over at Ben. He was utterly engrossed in a segment about a gulper eel, his face lit by the blue glow of the screen, a piece of popcorn halfway to his mouth. He wasn't perfect. He snored sometimes when he fell asleep on the couch. He drank coffee that could strip paint. He could talk for 20 minutes about the intricacies of bovine digestive systems. But his quirks were genuine. They were the green flags the blueprint had promised. He wasn't afraid to be silly, to build a blanket fort at 40 years old. He wasn't afraid to be quiet, to just sit in a comfortable silence. And he wasn't afraid to cry. I'd seen it, when he'd had to put down Old Man Jenkins's border collie last week. He'd come over afterward, his eyes red-rimmed, and just hugged me for a long time. He'd owned his sadness, hadn't tried to hide it or shove it down. That kind of emotional honesty was a language Mark had never spoken. "What?" he asked, noticing me looking at him. "Nothing," I said, smiling. "Just thinking how that eel looks like it's having a worse day than I ever have." He chuckled. "Right? Talk about a bad Monday." He tossed a piece of popcorn at me. I caught it and ate it. This was it. This was the upgrade. It wasn't a bigger house or a fancier car or a more exciting life. It was this, the peace, the easy companionship, the profound safety of being with someone who saw all my cracks and flaws, my lopsided pottery, my moments of irrational jealousy, my grief, and didn't see them as reasons to leave, but as parts of the whole interesting person he seemed to genuinely like. The documentary ended. The rain had softened to a gentle whisper. We dismantled our fort, folding blankets, untangling lights. It was a little sad, taking it down, like putting away a wonderful dream. But I knew we could build it again. That was the point. He helped me put the last blanket back on the couch. The room was back to normal, but it felt different. It felt like our space now, not just my space he was visiting. He turned to me before he left. I have an early call tomorrow. A horse with colic out past Willow Creek. He made a face. Not fun. Good luck, I said. Give him a pat for me. I will. He hesitated for a second, then leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a dramatic, passionate kiss. It was soft, sweet. It tasted like popcorn and felt like coming home. It was a kiss that said, I'll see you soon. He pulled away, smiled, and headed out into the damp night. I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to his sous vide crunch down the driveway. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different. It wasn't hollow, it was full. Full of the memory of laughter, the ghost of a blanket fort, the promise of a tomorrow that wasn't something to be endured, but something to be discovered. The final twist wasn't about Mark. It was this. The moment I realized my biggest fear had been being alone. But now, I wasn't choosing Ben because I was afraid of being alone. I was choosing him because he made my weird, post-heartbreak life a million times more fun. He made blanket forts and terrible coffee and conversations about cow stomachs feel like an adventure. And that simple, joyful, unassuming partnership was the upgrade I never knew I needed. The official-looking envelope came again. This time, it wasn't a shockwave. It was a final administrative thud. The divorce was final. The papers were signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Our 11-year marriage was now a matter of public record, a closed chapter in a ledger somewhere. I held the paper in my hands, expecting a tsunami of grief, of rage, of something. But it didn't come. There was only a quiet, hollow echo, like the sound in a room after all the furniture has been moved out. It was over. Truly, legally, irrevocably over. I didn't sit with it. I didn't light a candle or have a ceremonial burning. I filed it away in the cabinet with the cattle vaccination records and the old tax returns. It was just another piece of paper now, important to keep, but no longer a ghost haunting my kitchen table. The true ceremony happened that afternoon, alone in my equipment shed. I wedged a new lump of clay, my hands knowing the rhythm now, the pressure needed to push out the air bubbles. I centered it on the wheel, my body leaning into the familiar meditative motion. The hum of the wheel was the only sound. This wasn't an escape. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a homecoming. I didn't try to make a perfect vase or a symmetrical bowl. I let my hands guide the clay, not forcing a shape, but allowing one to emerge. What rose from the spinning wheel was something low and wide, with a gentle, uneven curve. It was sturdy, grounded. It had weight. I used the wooden rib Ben had helped me find, smoothing the surface until it felt like cool, wet skin. When I was done, I cut it from the wheel and set it on the shelf with the others to dry. It was my best piece yet. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It was mine. A few days later, a different kind of project presented itself. The old sign at the end of our driveway had been there for decades, since Mark's grandparents first built the place. It was faded and splintered, the painted name, Henderson Acres, almost completely weathered away. I'd been meaning to replace it for years, but it was one of those things that always got pushed aside. There was never time. There was always something more urgent. Now, there was time. I found a planed oak board in the barn, sanded it until it was smooth as silk. I sketched out the letters carefully, not in the old fussy script, but in a clean, strong font. I didn't paint Henderson Acres. That name belonged to the past, to a partnership that was dissolved. I painted a new name. One word, Wilder Root. It was a name that had come to me in the quiet of the pottery shed. It spoke of land that was untamed, resilient, growing back stronger after a fire. It spoke of being deeply anchored yet wild at heart. It was me. Ben came over as I was wrestling the old post out of the ground. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just picked up a shovel and started digging the new hole, deeper and wider. We worked in comfortable silence, the thunk of the shovel and the cry of a distant hawk, the only sounds. He held the new post steady while I mixed and poured the concrete, our movements a seamless, wordless dance. When the concrete had set, we lifted the new sign together, slotting it into place. Wilderroot Farm. It stood there, bold and new against the endless sky, a declaration of independence written in oak and black paint. We stepped back to look at it, our shoulders brushing. His arm went around me, not a possessive gesture, but one of solidarity, of shared pride. "It's perfect," he said, his voice quiet. "It's a start," I replied, leaning into him. Later, we were on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the fields in shades of orange and purple. The silence between us was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "I was thinking," he said, his fingers laced with mine. "The old Miller place next door is going up for rent. The house is small, but the land is good. I could lease the pasture. Keep a few head of my own over there. Be closer for early morning calls and late nights." He wasn't asking to move in with me. He wasn't blurring any lines or rushing anything. He was a man who worked with animals and the land, and he was proposing a practical, logistical solution that would weave his life a little more deftly into the fabric of mine. It was a next step, a real one. I looked out at my land, at our land, the land that had witnessed so much pain and was now witnessing this quiet, steady rebirth. I thought of the final papers in the filing cabinet. They had ended one story, but they weren't the end of my story. They were the turning point. I had been so afraid of being alone. I had defined myself for so long as one half of a whole that when I was suddenly made singular, I didn't know who I was. But I knew now I was the woman who fixed her own tractors, who made lopsided pottery, who danced alone in a barn at 3 a.m., who built blanket forts and kissed a kind man on her porch swing. I was the owner of Wilderroot Farm. I wasn't choosing Ben because I was afraid of being alone. I was choosing him because he saw that woman, the whole singular, imperfect woman, and he loved her. He made my life brighter and funnier and more real. And I did the same for him. The upgrade was never about finding a better man to replace a bad one. It was about becoming a better, fuller version of myself and finding a partner who cherished that woman. I squeezed his hand. "The Miller place has good water," I said, my voice steady and sure. "I think that's a great idea." He smiled, that slow, warm smile that reached his eyes, and pulled me a little closer. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first fireflies of the evening blinked to life over the fields. The past was finally, completely, behind me. And the future, for the first time, felt not like something to be feared, but like a wide open field, ready for planting.